The cabin lights dimmed as passengers drifted into sleep at 35,000 feet. Then the captain's voice shattered the silence with an impossible request that made every heart stop. Combat pilot needed immediately. Eyes turned, whispers spread, fear gripped the aircraft. And in seat 8A, a woman in an old denim jacket stirred awake, carrying a secret that would save 300 lives. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The night sky stretched endlessly above the Atlantic Ocean, a vast black canvas dotted with stars that most people never took the time to notice anymore. And far below, the dark waters churned and rolled, indifferent to the metal tube flying high above them, carrying 300 souls from one continent to another. And inside that metal tube, Flight 227 from Boston to London hummed with the familiar sounds of a red-eye crossing, the low drone of engines, the occasional cough, the rustling of blankets, the soft beeping of call buttons that passengers pressed when they needed water or an extra pillow. And the cabin lights had been dimmed an hour ago, creating that artificial twilight that airlines use to trick bodies into sleeping across time zones. And passengers had settled into their uncomfortable positions, necks bent at angles that would surely cause pain in the morning, mouths slightly open, arms crossed or tucked under makeshift pillows. And flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles, their shoes barely making a sound on the carpet, checking on passengers, picking up empty cups, offering blankets to those who looked cold. And in seat 8A, tucked against the window in the fourth row of economy class, a woman slept with her forehead pressed against the cool plastic of the fuselage. And her name was Captain Elena Cross, though nobody on this airplane knew that name or the weight it carried. And to every person who glanced her way while shuffling to the bathroom or stretching their legs, she looked utterly unremarkable. And she wore a faded denim jacket that had seen better days, with frayed cuffs and a small tear near the left pocket. And her jeans were plain, dark blue, nothing special. And her sneakers were white canvas, scuffed and worn, the kind you buy at a discount store and wear until they fall apart. And her dark hair was pulled back in a loose, messy bun, with strands escaping and falling across her face. And she had no makeup on, her skin pale and tired looking in the dim cabin light. And there was nothing about her appearance that suggested she was anything other than an ordinary traveler, maybe a student flying home, or a young professional trying to save money by taking the cheapest flight available. And that was exactly how Elena wanted it. Because for the past 6 months, she had been working very hard to be invisible, to blend into the background of normal life, to become just another face in the crowd. And before those 6 months, Elena Cross had been anything but invisible. And she had been Captain Elena Cross, United States Air Force, one of the youngest women ever to fly the F-22 Raptor in combat missions. And her call sign had been Viper, a name she had earned not through aggression but through precision, through her ability to strike fast and accurate, to make decisions in split seconds that other pilots needed minutes to process. And she had flown missions over territories that most people would never hear about, in skies where a single mistake meant death, where enemy radar painted you as a target and missiles locked onto your aircraft while you pulled G-forces that made your vision narrow and your body feel like it weighed 1,000 pounds. And Elena had been good at it, better than good. And her commanding officers had called her a natural, had fast-tracked her through promotions, had assigned her to squadrons that handled the most dangerous operations. And she had led teams, had trained younger pilots, had become the person others looked to when things went wrong. And for 10 years, that had been her entire life, the cockpit, the missions, the adrenaline, the constant edge between life and death. And she had loved it, even though she would never admit that to anyone now. But then came the mission that changed everything. And it had been a routine patrol, or at least that is what the briefing had called it. And Elena had been leading a 2-aircraft formation over a conflict zone, providing air support for ground troops who were engaged with enemy forces. And everything had been going according to plan until the ground situation changed rapidly, until enemy reinforcements appeared from nowhere, until the radio chatter became frantic with calls for help. And Elena had made a decision. And she had ordered her wingman, a young pilot named Lieutenant Marcus Webb, call sign Falcon, to engage a target that intelligence had identified as an enemy ammunition depot. And Marcus had followed orders, had locked onto the target, had fired. And the explosion had been massive, far larger than expected. And in the chaos that followed, it became clear that the intelligence had been wrong, that the building was not just an ammunition depot but also housed civilians who had been sheltering from the fighting. And Marcus's aircraft had been caught in the blast wave, had lost control, had spiraled down despite his desperate attempts to recover. And Elena had watched on her instruments, had heard his voice over the radio, calm at first, then confused, then scared. And she had screamed at him to eject, had ordered him to punch out, but something had malfunctioned, or maybe he had waited too long, and his aircraft had hit the ground at full speed. And there had been no parachute, no ejection, no survival. And Elena had completed the mission, had flown back to base on autopilot, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the stick. And the investigation had cleared her of any wrongdoing, had blamed faulty intelligence, had called it a tragic accident. And Marcus Webb's name had been added to the memorial wall, another hero lost in service. And Elena had been offered counseling, had been told to take some time, had been assured that these things happen in war. But Elena could not accept that. And every time she closed her eyes, she saw Marcus's aircraft going down. And every time she tried to sleep, she heard his voice on the radio. And the weight of that decision, of giving the order that led to his death and the deaths of civilians, crushed her in ways that no amount of counseling could fix. And so, 3 months after the incident, Elena Cross had submitted her resignation from the Air Force. And she had walked away from the only life she had ever known, from the uniform, from the medals, from the call sign Viper. And she had moved to a small apartment in Boston, in a neighborhood where nobody knew her and nobody asked questions. And she had taken a job at a used bookstore called Chapter and Verse, a quiet place that smelled like old paper and coffee, where her most difficult decision each day was whether to shelve a book in the mystery section or the thriller section. And the owner, an elderly man named Mr. Peterson, had hired her without asking much about her background, had simply appreciated that she showed up on time and did not mind the long, quiet hours. And Elena had built a new life, a small life, a life where she restocked shelves and recommended books to customers and went home to her empty apartment and tried very hard not to think about the sky. And she had told herself that this was better, that being responsible for books instead of lives was what she needed. And most days, she almost believed it. And tonight, she was on this red-eye flight because Mr. Peterson had insisted she take a vacation, had said she looked exhausted, had practically forced a week off on her. And Elena had chosen London because it was far away and because she had never been there as a civilian, only flown over it at altitudes where the city looked like a scattering of lights. And she had booked the cheapest ticket she could find, this middle-of-the-night flight on this aging 767 that rattled slightly whenever it hit turbulence. And she had boarded with her small backpack, had found seat 8A, had tucked herself against the window, and had closed her eyes before the plane even took off. And she had not spoken to the businessman in 8B or the college student in 8C, had just pulled her jacket tight and let the engine noise lull her toward sleep. And for the first time in months, her mind had gone quiet, the constant replay of Marcus's last moments finally fading into the background. And she had been asleep for maybe 2 hours when the announcement came. And at first, it filtered into her dreams, a voice that sounded distant and strange. But then her training kicked in, that part of her brain that never fully slept, that was always listening for threats, for changes in engine pitch, for anything unusual. And her eyes opened slowly, her mind still foggy, trying to separate dream from reality. And the voice came again, clearer this time, over the cabin intercom system. And it was the captain's voice, but there was something in the tone that made every instinct Elena had developed over 10 years of combat flying suddenly snap to attention. And the voice said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds speaking. I need your immediate attention. If there is anyone on board with combat pilot experience, any military flight experience at all, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." And the cabin, which had been filled with the peaceful sounds of sleep, suddenly went completely silent. And it was the kind of silence that happens when every single person stops breathing at the same time, when 300 hearts skip a beat in unison. And then the silence shattered into chaos, whispers exploding across the rows, people sitting up, looking around with wide eyes, confusion and fear spreading like wildfire. And Elena sat frozen in her seat, her mind racing. And she heard the businessman next to her mutter, "What the hell? Combat pilot? Is this some kind of joke?" And she heard a woman behind her gasp, oh my God, what's happening?" And she heard a child's voice, small and frightened, ask, "Mommy, why does the captain want a combat pilot?" And flight attendants appeared in the aisles, moving quickly, their faces pale despite their training to stay calm. And Elena watched as a young blonde flight attendant stopped at row 5, leaning down to ask passengers in hushed, urgent tones, "Are you a pilot? Do you have any flight experience?" And the passengers shook their heads, looking terrified, and the flight attendant moved on, her desperation growing with each negative response. And Elena's heart pounded in her chest, and her first instinct was to sink lower in her seat, to pull her jacket up over her face, to become invisible the way she had been working so hard to be for the past 6 months. Because she had left that life behind. And she had walked away from the cockpit, from the responsibility, from the weight of making decisions that determined whether people lived or died. And she had sworn to herself that she would never put herself in that position again. But even as she tried to make herself smaller, her mind was already working, analyzing, processing. And she knew, with absolute certainty, what kind of situation would make a commercial airline captain ask for a combat pilot. And it was not engine failure, because there were 2 pilots in the cockpit perfectly capable of handling that. And it was not bad weather, because instruments and training covered that. And it was not even a medical emergency, because a combat pilot would not be useful for that. And the only reason to ask for a combat pilot specifically was if there was a threat, an external threat, something military in nature. And Elena felt ice run through her veins because if that was true, then everyone on this plane was in serious danger. And the flight attendant had reached row 8 now, and she stopped next to Elena's row, asking the businessman in 8B, "Sir, are you by any chance a pilot?" And the man shook his head quickly, annoyance mixing with fear on his face. "I'm an accountant. I sell tax software. I don't even like flying." And the flight attendant's face fell, and she turned to the college student in 8C, who looked barely 20 years old, and before she could even ask, the student said, "I'm pre-med. I've never even been on a small plane before." And then the flight attendant's eyes landed on Elena, and there was something in her gaze, a desperation that was almost painful to see. And she leaned across the businessman, her voice shaking slightly as she asked, "Miss, do you have any flight experience? Anything at all? Even small aircraft?" And Elena opened her mouth, and for a moment, no sound came out. And she could feel the eyes of nearby passengers turning toward her, waiting for her answer. And she could say no, could shake her head, could let this moment pass. And the flight attendant would move on, would keep searching, would maybe find someone else or maybe not. And Elena could stay in her seat, stay hidden, stay safe from the responsibility she had been running from. But then she heard it again, that child's voice from a few rows back, now crying, asking, "Are we going to die?" And the mother's response, trying so hard to sound brave, "No, baby, no, everything's going to be okay." And Elena thought about Marcus. And she thought about how she had made one wrong call, had given one order based on bad intelligence, and he had died. And she had carried that guilt every single day since. And she had told herself that she was done being responsible for lives, that she could not handle that burden anymore. But sitting here, on this plane, listening to 300 people breathing fear into the recycled air, Elena realized something. And it was that running away from responsibility did not erase the skills she had, did not erase the training, did not erase the fact that she might be the only person on this aircraft who could help. And if she stayed silent now, if she let her fear and her guilt keep her in this seat, and something terrible happened, then she would be carrying 300 ghosts instead of just one. And that was a weight she knew she could not survive. And so Elena took a deep breath, and she looked up at the flight attendant, and she said, her voice quiet but steady, "I'm a pilot." And then, louder, so there was no misunderstanding, "I'm a combat pilot. United States Air Force. 10 years active duty. F-22 Raptor. I can help." And the effect was immediate and electric. And the flight attendant's eyes went wide, her hand flying to her mouth, and she gasped, "Oh, thank God, thank God." And passengers in nearby rows turned to stare at Elena, shock written across their faces. And the businessman next to her looked at her like he had never seen her before, like she had just transformed from an ordinary tired woman into something completely different. And the flight attendant grabbed Elena's hand, pulling her up from her seat with surprising strength, saying, "Please, please come with me right now. The captain needs you immediately." And Elena stood, her legs feeling shaky, adrenaline already starting to flood her system the way it used to before missions. And as she stepped into the aisle, the college student in 8C looked up at her with awe and whispered, "You're really a fighter pilot?" And Elena nodded, and she did not know what else to say, so she just said, "I was." And as she followed the flight attendant toward the front of the plane, walking down the narrow aisle between rows of seats, Elena became aware of every single eye in the cabin turning to watch her. And whispers erupted in her wake, "Did she say Air Force? F-22, that's the stealth fighter, right? She looks so young. Is this really happening?" And an elderly man reached out as she passed, touching her arm gently, and when she looked at him, she saw tears in his eyes, and he said simply, "God bless you." And a woman holding a baby called out, "Please help us," her voice breaking. And a teenage girl stared at Elena like she was looking at a superhero, with that expression of hope and disbelief mixed together. And Elena felt the weight of all those expectations settling onto her shoulders, heavier than any G-force she had ever pulled in a fighter jet. And the flight attendant led her through the galley, past the drawn curtains that separated economy from business class, and then to the reinforced cockpit door. And she pulled out her key card, her hands shaking so badly it took her 2 tries to swipe it correctly. And the lock clicked, and the heavy door swung open, and Elena stepped through into the cramped cockpit. And the first thing she noticed was the tension, thick and palpable, like walking into a wall of stress. And the 2 pilots, Captain Reynolds and First Officer Chen, both turned to look at her, and the relief on their faces was so intense it was almost heartbreaking. And Captain Reynolds was maybe in his late 50s, with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting at instruments and horizons. And First Officer Chen was younger, early 30s maybe, Asian features, normally calm and composed based on the way he carried himself, but right now looking pale and shaken. And Captain Reynolds said, his voice rough with strain, "You're the combat pilot." And Elena stepped forward into the small space, her eyes already scanning the instrument panels, the radar screens, the warning lights. And she said, "Captain Elena Cross, former United States Air Force, F-22 pilot, 10 years active duty. What's your situation?" And Captain Reynolds exhaled like he had been holding his breath for hours. And he gestured to the co-pilot's seat, which First Officer Chen immediately vacated, moving to stand behind them. And as Elena slid into the seat, her hands automatically finding the positions they had been trained to find, muscle memory taking over, Captain Reynolds began to explain. "About 30 minutes ago, we started experiencing system failures. It started small, autopilot glitches, then navigation drift. We corrected manually, thought maybe it was just equipment aging. But then we lost radio contact with air traffic control. All frequencies, just static. And then the radar started showing something that shouldn't be there." And he pointed to the radar screen, and Elena's blood ran cold. Because there, clear as day, was a blip that was not supposed to exist. Another aircraft, no transponder signal, no identification, flying in controlled airspace at their altitude, matching their speed, maintaining a position off their right wing. And Elena's training kicked in immediately, her mind cataloging details. Distance, approximately 500 meters. Speed, matching exactly. Altitude, identical. And that was not normal traffic, not even close. Commercial aircraft did not fly that close without coordination, without communication, without identification. And military aircraft did not shadow civilian planes unless something was very, very wrong. And she asked, keeping her voice calm and professional, have they made any contact? Any communication at all? And First Officer Chen answered, his voice tight. Yes, about 10 minutes ago. A transmission came through on emergency frequency. The voice was distorted, artificial sounding. They said we were off course and needed to comply with new coordinates they were transmitting. And Elena's jaw clenched because that confirmed her worst fear. This was not a random encounter, not a navigation error. This was a deliberate intercept, a threat, possibly a hijacking attempt. And she asked, did you follow the coordinates? And Captain Reynolds shook his head. No. We maintained our flight plan. And that's when they got aggressive. And as if on cue, the radar showed the unknown aircraft shifting position, moving closer, cutting across their flight path in a maneuver that was clearly intended to intimidate. And the plane shook slightly from wake turbulence, and Elena heard gasps from the cabin behind them. And then the radio crackled to life, and a voice came through, cold and distorted and utterly devoid of emotion. Flight 227, this is your final warning. Alter course to transmitted coordinates immediately, or we will take action. And the cockpit went silent except for the hum of electronics and the rush of air outside. And Captain Reynolds looked at Elena, and she could see the question in his eyes, the desperate need for someone to tell him what to do, how to protect the 300 lives behind him. And Elena stared at the radar screen, at the blip representing the hostile aircraft, and her mind raced through possibilities. And she thought about her training, about intercept protocols, about the psychology of aerial confrontation. And she knew that whoever was flying that plane was testing them, pushing to see how they would react, whether they would panic, whether they would comply out of fear. And she also knew that if they followed those coordinates, they would be flying into unknown territory, possibly toward a landing site where armed people waited, where the passengers could be taken hostage, where this situation could become infinitely worse. And giving control to an unknown hostile force was never the right answer. And so Elena turned to Captain Reynolds and said, her voice steady and authoritative, do not alter course. We maintain our current heading toward London. We need to regain contact with air traffic control and get fighter escort as soon as possible. And Captain Reynolds nodded, trusting her, and Elena moved to the communication panel. And her fingers flew over switches and dials, trying different frequencies, bypassing the interference that was blocking their signals. And it was sophisticated jamming, military grade, which told her that whoever was behind this had significant resources and training. And while she worked, the hostile aircraft made another pass, this time coming even closer, close enough that Elena could see its shape through the cockpit windows. And it was not a standard aircraft, not military in any configuration she recognized, but modified, irregular, with attachments that could have been surveillance equipment or weapons or both. And the radio crackled again, the distorted voice returning. Flight 227, you have 60 seconds to comply. After that, we will demonstrate our commitment. And Elena's heart pounded, but her hands remained steady. And she switched to emergency frequencies, sending out distress signals in patterns that any military monitoring station would recognize. And she kept trying, kept broadcasting, kept hoping that somewhere, someone was listening. And then, like a miracle, a faint voice came through the static. I-227, this is, Ender Control, you read. And Elena grabbed the mic, her voice urgent. Gander Control, this is Flight 227, we read you broken but present. We are being intercepted by hostile unknown aircraft. Request immediate military assistance. Current position. And she read off their coordinates from the navigation display. And the voice from Gander came back, stronger now. Flight 227, we copy hostile intercept. We are scrambling fighter escort from Goose Bay. Estimated arrival 15 minutes. Maintain current heading. Do not deviate. Help is coming. And the relief that flooded the cockpit was almost physical. And Captain Reynolds slumped slightly in his seat, and First Officer Chen let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. And Elena felt her own tension ease just slightly, though she knew they were not safe yet. 15 minutes was a long time when a hostile aircraft was circling you like a shark. And the hostile aircraft must have heard the transmission or sensed the change somehow, because it suddenly accelerated, cutting directly in front of them in a maneuver so aggressive that Captain Reynolds had to bank hard to avoid collision. And the plane tilted, passengers screamed, and alarms blared as the aircraft's systems protested the sudden movement. And Elena grabbed the yoke, helping Reynolds steady the plane, and she could feel the resistance, the weight of the massive commercial jet fighting against the sudden direction change. And they leveled out, but the hostile aircraft was now directly ahead, slowing down, forcing them to either slow down as well or risk ramming it. And Elena made a decision. And she said to Reynolds, "I'm taking manual control of throttle. I'm going to match their speed, make them think we're complying, but we're not deviating course. We just need to buy time until the fighters arrive." And Reynolds nodded, and Elena's hands moved over the throttle controls, reducing speed gradually, keeping the aircraft stable. And the hostile plane maintained its position ahead of them, like a pace car, trying to guide them off course. But Elena kept their heading locked, kept their navigation system pointed toward London, even as their speed decreased. And the minutes crawled by, each one feeling like an hour. And Elena watched the clock, watched the radar, watched the hostile aircraft. And she kept talking to Gander Control, giving updates, confirming that help was still coming. And in the cabin, passengers had gone from panic to a strange, tense silence. And the flight attendants had done their best to calm people, but everyone could feel that something was terribly wrong, could feel the unusual movements of the plane, could sense the fear in the crew. And then, finally, the radar showed 2 new contacts approaching fast from the west. And Elena's heart leaped because she recognized those signatures, the speed, the altitude, the approach pattern. Military fighters. F-18s based on the radar profile. And within seconds, a new voice came over the radio, strong and confident. "Flight 227, this is Viper lead from Canadian Forces. We have visual on you and the hostile aircraft. We are taking up escort positions. You are now under our protection." And Elena smiled at the call sign Viper, the same one she used to have, and she grabbed the mic. "Viper lead, this is Flight 227. We have a very grateful pilot and 300 passengers who are happy to see you." And the F-18 swept into position, one on each wing of the commercial aircraft, their presence unmistakable, their message clear. And the hostile aircraft, suddenly faced with military opposition, broke off immediately, banking hard and accelerating away, disappearing into the clouds like it had never been there. And the cabin erupted in cheers as passengers who had been watching through windows saw the fighter jets, saw their rescuers, saw hope. And Captain Reynolds keyed the cabin intercom and said, his voice shaking with emotion, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now safely escorted by military aircraft. The threat has passed. We will be landing at our original destination. You are safe." And the applause was deafening, people crying and hugging and laughing with relief. And Elena sat back in the co-pilot seat, her hands finally starting to shake as the adrenaline began to fade. And Captain Reynolds reached over and squeezed her shoulder, and he said, "Thank you. You saved every person on this plane." And Elena shook her head. "You would have done the same. You kept everyone calm. We did this together." And the flight continued to London under fighter escort, and the landing was smooth and perfect. And when the wheels touched down, the cabin erupted again in applause, and fire trucks and emergency vehicles lined the runway, though they were not needed. And when the plane finally came to a stop at the gate, Elena stood to leave, to slip away quietly. But the moment she stepped into the cabin, every single passenger stood up and began to applaud. And the little girl who had been so scared ran up to her and hugged her legs, and her mother had tears streaming down her face as she said, "Thank you for bringing my baby home safely." And Elena knelt down and looked at the little girl and said, you were very brave. I'm proud of you." And as she walked through the airport, officials wanted to debrief her, reporters wanted to interview her, but Elena just wanted to disappear again. And yet, as she sat in a quiet corner of the terminal, waiting for her next flight, she realized something important. And it was that she could not run from who she was. And being a pilot, being someone with skills and training, meant that sometimes you would be called on to use those skills when people needed you. And maybe Marcus's death was not about her failure, but about the fact that in war, terrible things happen, and you have to find a way to keep going. And Elena Cross, the woman who had tried so hard to hide in Seat 8A, realized that maybe it was time to stop hiding. And maybe it was time to be Viper again, not in war, but in life, ready to help when help was needed. And as she boarded her connection, she made a decision. And she would go back to Boston, would thank Mr. Peterson for the job, but would also start looking into civilian flight instruction, or maybe search and rescue, or something where she could use her skills to save people instead of running from the past. And 300 people were alive today because she had been in Seat 8A. And that was worth something. That was worth everything.